and gentlemen, to this interesting meeting that we have today on the economic and maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, the connection between Europe and East Asia. It's an honor to have you with so many. I think we have somewhere around 250 subscribers, which is great news. And I'm grateful also for the possibility that I am allowed to moderate this session. We have today some distinguished speakers, and I'm gonna introduce them to you in a while. But to first, let me kick off a bit on the topic of the first session, which is on critical raw materials and also the energy transition. The whole world is starting up energy transition activities, and for that, of course, there's a lot of new technologies and also materials required. You've seen the news already. Critical raw materials in all kind of ways are an important ingredient for that transition and for the technologies we need to make that transition happen. And I think it's also the ambition of both the European Union and EU as Europe as such, and also East Asia, to ensure that this goes well and that we do indeed have the capacity to build these new technologies. So one of the questions, of course, the overriding question is, okay, how can we secure our economic development while meeting the necessities for the energy transition? And should we work on alternative value chains, and what about stability and price? Before I start introducing our distinguished speakers, let me first introduce myself. I'm Michael Rademacher. I'm the Deputy Director of the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. And I'm looking forward to be a moderator for the next more or less 2 hours. So let me start introducing to you our first speaker, and then I'll introduce all three of them. But let me start with Mr. Kotaro Shimizu. I hope I pronounced it correctly, sir. You're the Chief Analyst from Mitsubishi Research Consulting, and your expertise is in circular economy, policies, businesses, mineral resources, of course, economic security policy, technology developments, and the fusion of policy, environmental protection, and technologies. So quite an expertise background, and I suppose that you probably can allude a bit further to what you do even more than that. The second speaker will be Ms. Abigail Wulf. She's the Vice President and Director of the Center for Critical Materials Strategy of the US SAFE organization. She's also the Director of the Ambassador. She's the Ambassador, Alfred Hofmans, representatives in that sense of the center. And she brings a wide and broad range of knowledge on earth science expertise to the center, researching rare earth and lithium-rich pegmatites, to work for NASA with NASA researchers. So that's quite an impressive field of expertise as well, Abigail. And last but not least, and he will join us hopefully in a couple of minutes, is Mr. Jeff Amrish Ritoe. He's strategic advisor and energy expert at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, amongst other activities. And he's an energy professional with over 15 years of experience in negotiating commercial agreements, acquisitions, and divestments in the energy industry. So quite a nice lineup. And we would like to start now with the first presentation and talk by Mr. Kotaro Shimizu. Please, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for my introduction, Mr. Vega Baker. Your pronunciation sounds perfect for me. Okay, I'd like to share my screen for a moment. So can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. At
Okay.
least I can.
Okay, thank you. So Mr. Rademacher has already introduced me before. In addition to his introduction, I'd like to add some another information about also ISO international organization, international standard organization. I'm an expert of also ISO TC298 rare earth and also 333 lithium and also 323 circular economy and for TMB strategic advisory group, critical minerals. I'm working in this field, especially for the critical raw materials, which will be used for the battery material and also power generator, wind turbine, and electrical vehicle, and so on. So I'm very so pleased to make an introduction about the current situation of the Japanese person making in this field. And so I'd like to suggest some another new idea about how to promote the next collaboration between the EU, the United States, and Japan to mitigate the resource risks from the sustainability aspect. So first, I'd like to show the current situation of Japan, which Japan is imported as most of the mineral resources from foreign countries, excluding some very few minerals like gold and limestone. Especially for China, most of the critical minerals like rare earth and some graphite as a raw material for battery negative cathode imported from China mainly. And in addition to this aspect, we are just making this collaboration between the another supply chain pipeline with the Australia, Canada, and the South Africa, and South America countries like Chile, Peru. These figures show the result of Japanese economy's criticality assessment. Lower left figure shows the result of criticality assessment in 2015, which was run by the staff of the JOGMEC, which is the governmental organization under the control of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, Japanese government. Please look at the upper right side of the lower left figure. Some critical raw materials like the heavy rare earth, which will be used for the magnet, and also PGM, platinum group materials like the platinum, palladium are located in the highly risk area, and so these elements are recognized as Japanese critical minerals. In addition to the other, looking at the other raw materials like tungsten, which are symbolized as a W atomic symbol, and Sb antimony, which will be used for the plastic ingredient, and Si silicon, which will be used for the semiconductor, are also imported from China mainly. So for Japan, though the issue of critical raw materials sometimes is equal to the issue of China. Let me remind you that there is a political conflict between these two countries, Japan and China. So we are also consider not only the criticality, the stable procurement of critical raw materials, but another aspect like the national defense, like the naval power or army power. This is so very good example of the supply chain of critical raw materials from the resources countries to Japan, not only Japan, but the United States and the European countries. So this figure is shows us a very brief situation of the supply chain rare earth from China to the consumer countries like Japan, the United States and Europe. Most of the supply chain are dominated by Chinese manufacturers. Please look at the intermediate supply chain of the rare earth products like the rare earth magnet, so metal making process and also alloy making process are mostly yes, so occupied by the Chinese companies, and sometimes which are under the control of the Chinese government. So we just try to mitigate the diversify the supply chain of the rare earth materials to decrease the resource risks for Japanese economy. So this figure shows the very simple structure of the Japanese policy for the strategic securing the resources, which were set in 2012. This strategic plan consists of the three pillars. One is the determination of the critical materials and also concentrated funding, which are mainly covered by the JOGMEC. I have mentioned before, which one of the governmental organization under the control of the Japanese government. The second pillar is the promotion for securing upstream interests, which are promoting the funding and so exploring and mining projects in the foreign countries like Australia and Canada. The third pillar is the promotion for the material substitution, recycling, and stockpile. Regarding the recycling, this policy is sometimes connected with the circular economy in Japan. Some of the department of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry are promoting this policy, not only from the sustainability, national security aspect, but the sustainability aspect. So one of the good example of the collaboration between the United States, Europe, and also Japan is shown here. In 2011, the EU, US, Japan trilateral conference on critical minerals set, and now the Australia and Canada are included too, and so these 5 regions and the countries just discussing about how to make this a good collaboration to mitigate the criticality of the raw materials for the sustainability aspect, especially for the one of the good example for this topic is the criticality assessment and also research and development project on the battery materials and rare earth magnets project. So in the beginning of my presentation, I have mentioned about the international standardization ISO standards. So now I'm working in the field of international rule making on for the mitigation of the for the diversification of the resources procurement, not only for rare earth, but the other critical raw materials like the lithium, graphite, bromine, and the cobalt, nickel, platinum group metals, and so on. So in this topic, I want to emphasize the aspect like sustainability to set the new international standard to level playing field, the supply chain, because China is one of the biggest country to produce most of the such critical raw materials. We should consider the diversification of the procurement production of such raw material from the sustainability aspect. So the international standardization in this field from the aspect of sustainability to reduce the carbon dioxide emission and also promote the circular economy and considering the human rights and so on will be contribute to promote the diversification of the supply chain, not only China, but the other countries like Australia and Canada. This is the final slide of my presentation. Most of the issues in the sustainability aspect are connected with the critical raw materials, not only the circular economy, carbon neutrality, human rights, and so on. So we should consider this topic is very connected with complex connected with the other related topics like poverty reduction, social acceptance, and for the human rights of the indigenous people, and sometimes international rulemaking like the ISO, IEC, and the OECD guidance will be a powerful tool to promote the new making the new market consider featuring the sustainability aspect. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. A very comprehensive overview of what is all being undertaken in Japan. Interesting also to see which critical materials that Japan identifies, which I think are more or less the same as we have in Europe. And I'm a bit afraid that the rest of the world, including the US, will have more or less the same list. So that's the worrying part of it, because there's not enough at this point in time that's being mined. But maybe just one question on top of your excellent presentation, Mr. Kotaro, is what is the capacity of Japan with regard to refinery? Because we talk about the availability of the critical raw materials, but we still, if you would even suggest that you have it, you still need to refine it. Does Japan have refining capacity?
Yeah, that is a very good question from the actual aspect to discuss this topic to mitigate the resource risks. For example, so speaking of the capacity of the rare earth magnet, because of the rare earth and the battery materials, so one of the hotter topics we discussed today, approximately a fifth or seventh of the Chinese capacity of rare earth magnet production. So looking at the other countries, United States and the European countries, there is a few capacity of the master alloy making process or also smelting process rare earth magnet. So we are happy to make the collaboration to educate or train the engineers working in that process, because most of the engineers are concentrated in China now, excluding Japan. So we cannot ignore the education and training of such special expert to mitigate the resource risks.
Okay, yeah. And one of the first sheets you showed was on the various lines of logistics from where you imported the materials from. Are there any specific strategies or efforts made to further diversify the upstream uptake of materials for Japan?
Yes, one of the so important policy or implementation in such aspect is also funding. Funding the so new mining project in Australia, Canada, and sometimes which are supported by the so Japanese government subsidy, because so that is so insurance for the Japanese national from the aspect of so stable economic growth. So that is sometimes supported by the Japanese government as a subsidy.
Okay, okay. That's interesting to hear, because I think that is something that might also be very useful for the EU to take up. Yeah, maybe then a last question with regard to your presentation to get it a little bit more explained. One of the topics that I saw on your sheets is stockpiling. Maybe you can allude a little bit to that one as well.
Yes, so regarding a stockpile, yeah, this has a very long history after the World War II. One of the issue we are facing now is so flexible, selling was so buying in the so national financial aspect. So, however, so we are looking at the so more flexible stockpile, not by the so Japanese government, by the so private so sector. This is one of the so another so additional supportive implementation we are looking now.
Yeah, so I could imagine that the Japanese government set some rules on the level of stockpiling, maybe, or is that thinking going on?
Yes. So, and I'm sorry, I forget the detailed name of the so acts about the so stockpiling by the Japanese government. However, so they are planning the so detailed stockpile plan for some critical raw materials under the act of so National Economic Promotion Act, which has just so set in May last year.
Okay, interesting. Well, thank you so far for the explanations. And we of course will come back to you later also with questions of the audience. So for the audience, I think it's good to know that you can put in questions via the chat, the questions and answers button. We probably not being able to pick up all the questions if there are many, but we'll then try to select those that I think would be most interesting for the general public to hear the answers on of the lecturers, the speakers. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you, Miss Abigail Wulf. I already introduced you a bit, Abigail, but I guess that maybe on top of what I already told the audience, you might allude a little bit further to it. But anyway, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rademacher, and thank you to my other esteemed panelists. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. It is morning in Washington, D.C., where I am sitting right now. I don't have any slides prepared, but I plan to focus my remarks on three key areas. First off, how the United States is thinking about critical mineral security in the context of our national security and economy. Second, recently enacted legislation and also actions taken by both previously the Trump administration and the Biden administration in reaction to securing critical mineral supply chains. And then finally, potential for harmonization between Japan, the European Union, and the United States on working together to create these more secure and sustainable critical mineral supply chains, which we are all attempting to achieve right now. So first off, how does the United States think about critical minerals? And if you had asked me that question, 2 or 3 years ago, I would have said that the United States really isn't thinking that much about critical mineral security. Until recently, the last time the United States had really thought about critical minerals was over a decade ago, back in 2010 and 11, when China threatened to cut off Japan's supply of rare earth elements over the Senkaku Island dispute. So since then, the issue has sort of sparkled and faded away in the United States as prices stabilized and as, we were able to acquire those materials that we needed, but our dependence remained. It really wasn't until the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, when supply chains really burst back onto the scene as something that we needed to be aware of and something that we should be very worried about and thinking about how to secure supply chains a bit more. So with that, the China came onto the scene. We had, the Trump administration that was very focused on, correcting trade imbalances between the United States and China. And the pandemic, again, just showed that, the over-concentration of supply chains for vital materials such as personal protective equipment and, other key goods, semiconductors burst onto the scene as well. I don't know if anybody tried to buy a car or a dishwasher or a refrigerator or anything during that time, but, I did try to buy a car and it was incredibly difficult, just to get the materials that we needed. And then with the changing of administrations, just the war in Ukraine has also put just a huge spotlight on concentration for energy supply chains. In Europe, the oversupply of Russian oil and gas to fuel their energy economy has shown that, over-reliance on foreign actors that do not share democratic values, the same interests and values, can be incredibly dangerous for democracies to rely on just a single source. And so as different countries, the United States, Europe, and I believe Japan included, to hit these, zero emission vehicle targets, these clean energy and green economy targets, to meet climate change targets, we need to make sure that as we are transitioning from a fossil fuel based economy to a minerals based economy, that we are not becoming overly beholden again on concentrated supply chains. And as Mr. Kotaro's slides very keenly noted, critical mineral supply chains for everything from electric vehicle batteries to solar panels and wind turbines are incredibly concentrated within the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China. So how can we make sure that as we transition, that we are not beholden to the Chinese Communist Party, which again does not share, our same democratic ideals, and we have tensions with them over Taiwan, and we would like to make sure that, as our industries that rely on these critical mineral supply chains do not exist in a vacuum, that their over-reliance on the materials that they need for their end-use products cannot be leveraged in any sort of political way to make sure that we're making decisions that are counter to, our strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific. So the United States import reliance for critical raw materials, and the ones that we focus on specifically at my organization of SAFE, are primarily the battery materials and the materials needed for electric vehicles. The reason why we focus on those particular minerals is because we see our automotive sector as being a key component of our economy and the backbone of our very highly skilled workforce. The US automotive sector contributes approximately $1 trillion to our economy each year. It contributes to over 5%, either indirectly or directly, to our gross domestic product. And so again, when GM and Ford and others are making commitments saying that by, GM in particular, by 2035, they're only going to be selling zero emission vehicles that will rely on these critical raw materials by almost 6 times more than traditional internal combustion engine vehicles, that we need to make sure sure that they are able to access those materials so that our automotive sector does not inadvertently become hollowed out or again used inadvertently as a political pawn as they make this transition. So the United States is more than 50% import reliant for all of the battery materials except for lithium. We contain less than 4% of all minerals processing. As Mr. Rademacher rightly pointed out, it doesn't necessarily matter where you're digging something up because the majority of minerals processing currently takes place in China. So even if we mine more in the United States, we have to send the majority of that material to China to be turned into a usable compounding good. And because of that, we also aren't really making anything anymore in the United States. The concentration of that mineral processing has been very good for battery making in that industry because many battery makers like to co-locate with where minerals are being processed. And so, as partly due to that, China, produces more than 60% of battery cathodes and almost 90% of battery anodes, which are really the guts that go into those batteries and are some of the higher sort of IP value added parts to batteries. Whereas in the United States, we are just beginning to create cells, but for the most part, the majority of our gigafactories are really just assembling battery packs. And then in terms of mine production, while the United States is quite large, a bit larger in, geography than in landmass than, the European Union and Japan, we still don't have a ton of the reserves for these materials. For example, we have only, 0.3% of global nickel reserves, but I will put a little asterisk by that because as many on this webinar may understand, but a reserve is actually a known and economically viable deposit. And in the United States, we just haven't really been paying much attention to these particular minerals. And we also haven't been investing in geologic mapping in the ways that some of our other friends in Canada and Australia have been investing in geologic mapping, simply because mining does not make up that large a portion of our GDP. But now, given the strategic importance of these minerals, the United States Geological Survey, through its Earth Resources Mapping Initiative, is finally beginning to go out and try to figure out where there are more of these deposits so that we can get them. But currently, we really only have one active nickel mine, which is slated to actually close in 2025 or 2026. We have only one active lithium mine, and we only have one active rare earths mine. We do not have any active graphite mines or manganese mines. We did just open a new cobalt mine, the Jervois mine in Idaho, but just to put that mine in perspective, I believe that it's like about 1/10 of the size of one of the large cobalt producing mines in the DRC. So, we have a ways to go to try to increase our ability to provide the raw materials that we're going to need ourselves, but we're likely never going to be able to do that all alone, just in the United States. So moving on to recently enacted policies and legislation. The Trump administration really dealt with this issue in the form of tariffs. They, instigated 232 investigations into China on, unfair trade practices, whereas the Biden administration has really taken a different tack, a different approach, and has focused much more on incentives to try to diversify these supply chains and to increase the United States capacity to compete. So most notably, there's been the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, and the passage of the CHIPS and Science Act. And so I'm going to focus my remarks on the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, which I will refer to as, the bill and IRA, just for shorthand. But within the bill, they provided a lot of equity in forms of grants and a lot of debt in the form of loans through the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office to help incentivize, the creation of, most notably, battery material processing, manufacturing, and recycling within the United States. So, within the bill, there was almost $7 billion allocated for grants for those things. And also the DOE's Loan Programs Office was given additional lending authority to, not just clean technologies, but also to mining and processing facilities as well, which is quite notable. And actually the Department of Energy just a couple months ago issued the first tranche of funding for those battery material processing, manufacturing, and recycling grants at almost $2.8 billion to 20 different projects. And so those projects will help us really make the leap from, bench scale to commercial scale and being able to increase our processing capacity from sort of the measly 4% that we're at right now. And that's just for lithium. Within the IRA, it goes a bit further, and I'm sure there are lots of people on the line that have varying opinions, from disdain to admiration that go along with people's thoughts about the Inflation Reduction Act. And I agree, it's a bit of a contentious piece of legislation for some, but for us in the United States has had a pretty remarkable impact on getting industry to really step up to the plate and actually begin to stand up some of the facilities that we're really hoping to achieve in the United States. And that's mostly due to a lot of tax incentives that have been implemented within the law. So specifically, there's the re-upping of the clean vehicle tax credit, which used to previously be just an electric vehicle tax credit for $7,500, now expanded to clean vehicles, not just electric. But that grant comes with some stipulations, some strings attached. So, what we're seeing in the IRA is the first stick, so to speak. We've been getting a lot of carrots. I mentioned those big grant programs, the loans that were offered. We have a bunch of tax incentives, but to get at that really juicy carrot of the tax incentive, you need to make sure that, beginning when the draft guidance is issued, at least 40% of the value of your mined or processed mineral materials must come from the United States or a country with which the US shares a free trade agreement. And there's varying conversations around what constitutes a free trade agreement, which maybe we can get into in the question and answer session, or that material must be recycled in North America. And then for the battery portion of that grant, the battery components must be either manufactured or assembled within North America. And then there are other provisions that, are equally tied to this, but have less to do with critical minerals and more to do with the EV industry. And those include, final assembly rules within North America, which I know are rankling a lot of our friends and allies around the world, and also different the sticker price of the vehicle, and also income caps as well. So the focus right now really is on trade, looking at what those free trade agreement countries are. The US Trade Representative has a list of 20, but people are talking about, because in the legislative text, they don't say capital FTA, capital free trade agreement, that there might be a looser interpretation that you might be able to apply. And then the North America assembly requirements, what is final assembly? And then, one thing I forgot to mention is the final kicker, that, in addition to those critical material and battery assembly requirements, there's also a foreign entity of concern provision, which kicks in 2025 for critical minerals and in 2024 for batteries. None of the pieces that go into those components or constituent materials can come from a foreign entity of concern, which is currently defined in legislative text within the United States as meaning China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So that is a bit of a blunt tool to try to make sure that, we're not becoming overly reliant on China. And again, there will be, different discussions in the lead up to when the Internal Revenue Service here, the IRS, releases its, final or draft guidance for the IRA on, just what constitutes control by a foreign entity of concern. So finally, how do we harmonize trade across, Japan, the European Union and the United States, given some of the tensions that have been caused by the IRA and the fact that we do not have free trade agreements with Japan and the EU currently. There is a trade deal on the table between the US and Japan right now, but that trade deal does not include our auto sectors because, as you might imagine, there's some friendly competition that goes on there. Both of our auto sectors are very important to us. As Mr. Kotaro mentioned, the US, EU, and Japan have been working on these trilateral meetings since 2011 to, secure critical mineral supply chains, which is why it was a bit strange when the Inflation Reduction came out and the EU and Japan are two very close friends that we've been working on these issues for a very long time. We're not included, I would say explicitly in that legislation. But I would say that our organization is working to think about trade agreements in a slightly different way, perhaps through commodity-specific agreements rather than through economy-wide agreements. But I think the key point between those agreements would be ensuring that as we're sourcing critical raw materials for our tech-driven economies, that we are only sourcing materials that have been mined with the highest standards. Because right now, while critical mineral processing is the key choke point right now, with China containing anywhere from 50 to 100% of all minerals processing for the battery metals, you cannot begin to address the processing choke point without first addressing what the heck you're going to be processing. And it does just so happen that while China, geologically speaking, does not possess many of the reserves for these materials, they've been quite strategic in going around and making investments in these deposits around the world. It's very difficult to open up new deposits. It takes anywhere from 10, 15, 20 years to bring a new mine online. And in the United States, of course, we have, permitting hurdles and different social license hurdles, which Mr. Kotaro also referred to in his remarks. And so, and it's also just much more expensive to open up mines in the United States, Canada, Australia, some of these other places where, with our allies that we would like to be, diversifying supply chains into. So we see that in creating sort of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, but for minerals between our countries, making sure that, there are sanctionable, enforceable mechanisms to make sure that, beyond just saying, yeah, we want to make sure there's no child labor in our supply chains. Yeah, we want to make sure we're not contaminating rivers in our supply chains, that, instead of those being voluntary and nice to haves, that through trade agreements, which in the United States, again, are sanctionable and enforceable, that we're actually, enforcing those mechanisms and that they have teeth. And finally, I think on the circular economy, because all of our countries don't have the level of reserves of some of these other places, that once we reach, a critical mass of these batteries, it will be very important to us to work together to recycle them in a way and perhaps create a bit of a closed loop economy between our allied nations. I think I will conclude my remarks there, but thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Wolf. You touched upon a broad range of elements. Maybe, and the one that I didn't hear, but I think there's also activity going on, is on stockpiling. Maybe you can shortly allude to that, and then I'd like to go over to Mr. Amrish Ritoe.
Of course. In the United States, our stockpile is solely a defense stockpile, a national strategic stockpile, which is a bit different than our friends in Japan, which have an economic stockpile, which I think is something interesting that the United States may want to consider. But essentially, the conversations include, what should we be stockpiling in the first place? Some people talk about stockpiling the raw material, but because we do not process that material, it doesn't really make sense to stockpile the raw material. For the most part, it would be stockpiling end products, if anything, smart bombs and batteries. So to be determined, but I think that, we are beginning to refund our stockpile, which has been unfortunately sort of depleted over the years, but a new focus has definitely been put on that.
Okay, thank you, and we'll come back to you, of course, also during the discussions, especially also I think on the trade agreements and the IRA, because that's a hot potato also in Europe. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Jeff Amrish Ritoe. Of course, Amrish, we know each other well. I already introduced you in a couple of sentences earlier on, but I think it's interesting also to have you on board because you have also a business background in the industry. Maybe you can also allude to that a bit further and take us with you on some ideas and thoughts that you might have. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Michel, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining this super interesting subject, which is really in the hotspot at the moment. First of all, my apologies that I'm visible only now. The reason is that I'm actually in London, and as Michel already referred to, I am approaching the critical minerals theme more from a business perspective. And the reason why I'm in London is actually, I think, a good anecdote to indicate what's going on in this space. I'm here to look for potential investors in the processing of critical minerals. As Abigail, the previous speaker, indicated, processing is a key part to secure the raw materials that we need downstream in clean energy applications such as batteries that go into electric vehicles. Now, what we have seen over the past couple of years is that there has been a lot of attention and money flowing into downstream end applications. So Europe has been making more electric vehicles. There are several announcements on gigafactories where you will have 1 million kilowatt hour in battery capacity being built in Europe. And those initiatives are obviously very good, and they will definitely contribute to reducing greenhouse gases and CO2, notably. But the big challenge for Western countries is to get access to the materials that go into these downstream applications. And when you are looking at the materials you need, the first obvious place to look at is the mine, because you need to dig up that material from somewhere before you can actually continue further in the value chain. The second step, after you have mined minerals, you need to process it, because minerals out of the ground are not ready to be deployed in a battery. You need to chemically process them so that they are suitable to perform and deliver the performance that you expect a battery to deliver. And this is a crucial thing, because what we have seen in the past and up to now is that, yes, there is a lot of money flowing to gigafactories, but there is less attention to securing the upstream part, i.e. the mining and the processing. And what we have seen since last year is that the US has made a tremendous comeback when it comes to its place in the value chain by launching regulations such as the Inflation Reduction Act, but also by President Biden's invocation of the Defense Production Act, which gives a lot of executive authority to not only the president, but also to his cabinet and the staff supporting that cabinet, to set up a supply chain in the US that actually starts initially at processing. Now, there is some initiative to do mining in the US, but if you look critically and carefully to that new piece of regulation, it is really all about making sure that the US becomes a new processing hub to make sure that the raw materials that they need for downstream applications can get processed in the US and then find their way into a US-based supply chain. And I think that mismatch between what's needed downstream in the form of EVs and batteries and the need for more investments upstream is the biggest challenge that we face for the next 5 to 7 years. I'll stop there, Michel, in case you have any follow-up questions.
Yeah, so interesting observation, or also made already apart by the other two speakers. So the processing or refining capacity is one, but I guess it's in the end about the whole value chain. And if you look at Europe, we are basically missing out on mines, we're missing out on refineries, and we are even missing out parts on the production of components. So what do you think from the European perspective is the most important part that we should first work on?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And look, we have to be realistic. I think before I go into how to achieve it, let me explain what, in my opinion, is needed to change to make Europe less dependent on foreign material. We have to be realistic. If you want to control your own destiny, the ideal picture would be to have your own mining activities in your own jurisdiction, and then have all the activities all the way up to making your own batteries and placing them in cars that have been manufactured in your own jurisdiction. That's the ideal case. Unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world, and it is very difficult to get mining started in Europe. Permitting is an issue. Public positioning is an issue, i.e., not in my backyard behavior. As a consequence of that, a lot of politicians don't want to touch upon a sensitive subject, or a subject that they regard as sensitive, such as mining. And if it takes so long to get the permitting for mining in place, then let's perhaps go for some lower hanging fruit and put some effort into developing activities that, first of all, we are more comfortable with, but second of all, Europe is also familiar with. And for me, that is processing. The benefit of processing is, like I said, Europe is familiar with chemical processing. We have big chemical companies in Europe, such as BASF, Umicore, in the Netherlands as well. So we have a tradition, and we are familiar with those activities. But more importantly, the footprint of processing is significantly smaller. And Europe is densely populated, especially a country like the Netherlands. You can imagine that it makes more sense to conduct those activities and focus on those activities in the supply chain that have a smaller footprint. So for me, focusing on processing, and as a consequence of that, battery component manufacturing, makes more sense in Europe than putting a lot of effort into mining. I'm not saying that we should stop looking at mining. I'm just saying that if we want to improve our position in the supply chain and really strengthen our own supply chain, become less dependent, then perhaps processing and battery components is a more obvious place to start with.
Okay, yeah, I can imagine. I know that the EU is working on Critical Raw Materials Act. Not sure when it will see the daylight. I think there's rumors that it would be somewhere in March. What would be maybe from your perspective the most important element that should be strengthened in such an act?
I think a couple of things. First of all, be realistic. So you can say in the act that you will focus on mining, but as I just mentioned, in my view, it's not worth putting in a lot of effort in a process that will take a lot of time. We have to be cognizant of the fact that mining takes a long time in itself, even without the permitting issues, because it starts with exploration, which typically is 2 to 3 years. Then you need to develop the project, which takes another 2 to 3 years. before you actually start producing, and then let alone are on full capacity. So that whole process can take up to 10 years before you even get to commercial production from a mine. And that is without the permitting, right? So rather than looking at mining too much, I would say focus on the things that we are good at in Europe. We have the knowledge, the chemical knowledge. We have the off-takers, i.e. the gigafactories. And make sure that what you present in the Critical Materials Act, that it's really clear, right? Because what we're seeing right now is that because of this unclarity and uncertainty in Europe, a lot of investors and a lot of companies that want to make projects and want to become active in the supply chain move to the US for the simple reason that they just don't know what the EU wants to do and how their project will look like. So in the case of a commercial undertaking of, for instance, setting up a processing plant, you would want to know what kind of support do I get from the local government, not only in terms of grants and subsidies and loans, but also is there a power plan? Is there help in infrastructure? Is there local talent? So for all of these aspects, which are key to making a project a success, it is helpful if there is guidance from EU governments and in Brussels, but also locally, in what way they can accommodate these companies to set up their business in Europe.
Okay, that's an interesting one that we often tend to forget, that the infrastructure of the mine as such is one, but indeed that you need all kind of other infrastructures around it to make it indeed work. And it's also familiar to me that it takes quite some time before you get to nameplate the capacity of a mine indeed. So interesting to see the overall picture that is being sketched by all three distinguished speakers. And I think we all touched upon the same problems. It's about refinery, it's about diversification. Where can we get the minerals from? The stockpiling is differently organized. A little bit less is being said about the circular economy, which, as far as I know, at least in Europe, there's a lot of focus on critical economy for circular economy. But if you look in practice, it's a very small component that's being recycled. Partly because of the fact that, especially for some of the critical materials, are only used in small amounts or volumes in bigger infrastructures. So that is from a circular economy perspective, it's difficult to get a business case mining those critical materials in the urban mine, because they cannot compete with the price, or the technology is difficult, or there's more to earn with the base material there where it's mixed with than with the critical material. So maybe that's a question that I'd like to pose to both Mr. Kotaro and Ms. Abigail Wulf as a start. So Mr. Kotaro, maybe you could pick this one up.
Yeah, so that is one of the very important topic we should discuss, because we should consider not only the national economic security issue, but the sustainability issue like the circular economy and carbon neutrality. So my team running just an experimental project to maintain the circular flow of the critical minerals in some actual plant in Japan. One of the biggest problem we are facing is how to control the low-level content of the impurity element, like the Trump element in the steel scrap. So as Amrish has already mentioned about chemical process, the importance of chemical process we are also having a so similar thought about the so improvement of the so chemical plant to extract the so such trap element to control the quality of the so recycled material to maintain the so circular flow. In addition, this technical issue, so how to build a so efficient collection system under the control of the so local government or central government acts. That is another aspect to maintain the so circular flow with some critical minerals, not only from the so sustainability aspect, but also national security aspect.
Okay, thank you. Abigail.
So there are many different companies that are starting up, most notably, which many people have probably heard of, Redwood Materials, which is currently recycling EV batteries. There are also some smaller startups such as Li-Cycle, which is entering into, a joint venture with General Motors to recycle, I believe, some of their Ultium cells. Because we haven't reached a critical mass of electric vehicle batteries to recycle, and as you rightly mentioned, the amounts of these materials that we've been using up until now have been more in the grams, maybe a couple of grams in the batteries of, say, a laptop or in a cell phone. But when we're talking about electric vehicle batteries, we're talking about tens of kilograms. And just sort of based on the back of the napkin calculation that I've done, it would take recycling over 2,000 laptops to get enough lithium for one electric vehicle battery. And that's just not something that is, able to be done right now. And so right now, a lot of these recyclers are actually subsisting off of recycling battery scrap. And because we are not really creating batteries in the United States, it's difficult to get that scrap to recycle. So entering into these joint ventures has been very strategic for these smaller startup battery companies to make sure that they can get sort of the feedstock that they need to be able to sort of stay afloat until you get that critical mass of batteries in 10 or 15 years when sort of the life cycle of them is expected to come to an end. But as was mentioned, it will be critically important to recycle these materials because unlike oil and gas and traditional fossil fuels, which are consumed, minerals are simply used and they are infinitely recyclable. And yes, you probably have to, dope the recycled content sometimes with some additional virgin material to get it to the grade that you need to get to put back into a battery, but the technology is rapidly advancing where they're able to get closer and closer to the proper purity that you need to put back into an anode and a cathode. So to be seen how it becomes more economic, but I think the economies of scale will get there once we reach critical mass.
Yeah. So we'll come back. We'll look further into also what it also means in terms of rules and regulations and the harmonization, as you already said. But maybe let's first dive into a little bit on the availability of materials still, because critical materials, and you already said it, Abigail, is a matter of building up the urban mine. It takes a bit of time. But I guess also it's important to think about the design for recycling, which is also not the case yet, which makes it difficult to recycle materials. So I think that's something that is slowly picking up. I know, and at the Technical University in Delft, they're looking at that phenomena of design for recycling. But anyway, let's put it on hold for our discussions. There are a couple of questions also from the audience. And one of them is, which I found interesting, because I know that Japan is working on that, is deep sea mining. Maybe you can talk a bit more about that, Mr. Kotaro.
Yes, regarding deep sea mining, yes, it sounds very excellent and sounds very good. However, so looking at the reality of the deep sea mining, so I had sometimes those projects are facing some economic difficulties to extracting the deep sea mud containing the rare earth and the cobalt, and concentration process, economically efficient so process of the such deep sea mine product. So it will be the one of the yes, final card to show the some international gain of the critical raw materials. However, so looking at the reality of the economic supply chain of the raw materials, now it will be not the actual solution for us now.
Okay, yeah. And I guess, and that's maybe a question also to you, Abigail, is that there might be also a mining code coming up for deep sea mining in the US. Is that correct?
So I don't know exactly for the United States because we are not a party to the UN Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, which is, what the ISA is a part of, the International Seabed Authority, where that new regulation is forthcoming because of, I believe, a rule that was triggered by the metals company and the island nation of Nauru to go out and get the potato-sized polymetallic nodules from the 4,000 meters below the surface of the ocean in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. So the United States actually has sort of bracketed this issue, I believe is the term that the administration has used in the past. In the critical minerals report that was put out in response to the executive order on supply chains, the report actually did not even mention and explicitly said that they were not going to discuss seabed minerals. It's a bit of a third rail here in the United States when it comes to many of our environmental groups that say, more research needs to be done to make sure that we can truly understand the environmental impact that, picking up these nodules and, the sediment plumes that come from it might have. And as somebody who formerly worked at NASA and spent a lot of time looking at the Earth from space, I can certainly sympathize with those, thoughts. And, half of our oxygen does come from microscopic organisms within the ocean. But at the same time, when we're tackling so many social license issues here on land in the terrestrial environment, and when you think about how rich these particular potato-sized nodules, which are, resting on the seafloor, not necessarily something you need to blast or dig for. And, they're so energy dense, maybe there's a trade-off to be said there that, instead of digging up rainforests in Indonesia that are incredibly, rich in biodiversity and, can contaminate, water sources that, maybe it's better when you're not dealing with, communities or indigenous groups, it disturbing their lands and, contaminating them potentially, and instead going to something that they describe as sort of a desert in the ocean. But also as somebody from Phoenix, Arizona, I'm also sensitive to the fact that there's plenty of life in deserts. So, it's definitely something that humans and society is going to have to deal with because as humans, nothing that we do is zero impact. So there's going to have to be, people don't like talking about trade-offs. I think they prefer talking about offsets, but not something that we should not be blind to, a resource that we should keep in mind, but, tread carefully.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and maybe Michelle, if I can add to that, I think it's important that if we speak on behalf of Europe, that Europe stays tuned to these developments, right? So in the case of the International Seabed Authority, there is an opportunity for member states, and the Netherlands is a member state, to become a promoter of Dutch companies to be involved in this research and exploration for these nodules. Currently, the Dutch state doesn't even promote Dutch companies, which I think is a bad thing. I think we need to be involved, keep a finger at the pulse to know what's going on, rather than completely leave it to other countries.
And France has put a moratorium on it, right? Or something like that.
Yeah, but I think that's, sorry, Michelle, to
go ahead.
But there's a difference between whether it's an economic zone of a country, in which the country itself can determine itself what it wants to do with it. Like New Zealand banned the deep sea mining. And the Clipperton zone in the Pacific, which is basically overlooked by the international community. And I think that's where Europe has to step up and play a more active role.
Okay, talking about active roles and basically translated maybe back to competition. The question is, of course, how could we harmonize and work together? Because I think in the end, also looking at the value chain worldwide, we might try to, on the one hand, diversify. We want to have some refinery capacity on our continents. But at the same time, parts of the world are dominated by the fact that they have materials and others that do not have materials. So a question I think that is highly on the agenda of at least in the EU, but probably also in other parts of the world is how can we do the diversification, get rid of some countries that we over rely on for our supplies, and how do we then circumvene that we are in fierce competition, hampering each other instead of working together and make it better for all. So I think that's a question for all, and maybe I would like to start then again with Mr. Kotaro, and then followed by Ms. Wulf, and then Mr. Ritoe.
Okay, that is a very so basic, important agenda we should discuss, I think. Yes, going back to the question, why does China is dominating the most of the critical raw materials production in the world? So looking at the quality and the economically efficient process located in China, those technologies and processes should be the most economically competitive in the world we see. So going back to the how to harmonize the yes, solve the these some issues we are facing now, and we firstly make some progress on the advanced the research and development of the advanced technology like the intermediate process like chemical process Amrish has already mentioned, and that is not only from the cost aspect but the sustainability aspect like the carbon dioxide emission and circular economy, human rights, and so on. And then, yeah, especially speaking of the small market size of the critical raw materials like the lithium, rare earth, cobalt, and so on. If we try to start the development with a new mining project in the world, we can quickly face the oversupply problem because the market size is not so big. If some new additional mining project will be started. So in that case, we sometimes should consider how to make a good balance between demand and supply in the future market. So I sometimes emphasize in the Japanese government council committee, we should also consider the research and the development of the new application using the some raw materials which will be contribute to the sustainability society and energy transition and so on. So that sounds sometimes irony, discrepancy for some people. However, looking at the reality of the market size and good balance between the demand and supply, we should also consider how to make the good balance between demand and supply on the critical raw materials.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and as I pick up from this, from your point, is that if you focus on market size, then for some materials, it's more useful to work together and try to find a solution than for others. And indeed, balance between supply and demand then is of course critical. Thank you so far. Ms. Wulf, please, the floor is yours.
So there are plenty of things that we could be doing and that we are currently doing in terms of, information sharing and capacity building. I think in particular, the EU and Japan are a bit further along in minerals processing capacity than we are in the United States. For example, the EU is actually number 2 in minerals processing behind China for elements like nickel, which it has 10% of the world's processing capacity, cobalt, which actually has 15% of the world's processing capacity, and manganese, for which it has approximately 5% of the world's processing capacity. And Japan also has capacity for processing nickel around 4.5%, and also cobalt, around, just over 2%. So there are ways that the United States can sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. We can help to expand the processing capacity within Japan and the EU, while also trying to build up new capability in the United States. But, I would also say that these are very energy intensive industries, and that, while we'd be happy to help build up the capacity within our friends in Europe, right now, I believe they're facing a bit of an energy crunch right now. And so just how practical is it also for them to be building up that capacity right now as well? One other area where we're actively working is through the State Department, U.S. State Department's Mineral Security Partnership, the MSP. And that particular endeavor is trying to bring together high income countries to think about how to funnel capital, how to fund responsible mining projects. And so I believe there are many conversations going around in the United States. For example, in the Department of the Interior is leading an interagency working group to define what responsible mining looks like in the United States. They were supposed to put out those findings sometime last year, but we still have not seen how the administration is going to define responsible mining. But meanwhile, the Mineral Security Partnership is pushing ahead, and I believe they are about to announce, because it's almost a year since the MSP was announced at the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada meeting last year, and that meeting is coming up, I believe, at the beginning of March. And I believe that they're going to be announcing at least 16, potential deposits where they could be funneling that capital. I think, of course, there is some sensitivity to the fact, in the United States at least, that, we want to make sure we do not repeat any colonialist mistakes of the past, and that we aren't just going to some of these lower income countries, most likely in the global south, that contain the majority of these resources, and just taking these resources for our technology driven economies. I know that many of these countries are very interested in moving down the value chain, so to speak, so that they actually have more of that processing capacity. So I believe that, we should be working to help build up that capacity for them in their own countries, so that they can also capture some of that value add. And again, maybe providing a counterweight to China, which is very active in these spheres, so that we don't cede, ground to them in, the entire continent of Africa, essentially, and also in large swaths of South America, Central America as well. So, capacity building, looking at some, we recently signed an MOU. We had in Washington, D.C., a big meeting among the president here. President Biden met with many of the presidents and leaders of African nations just recently and signed an MOU, which I believe included critical minerals. We do have, it's not a trade agreement, but we have something called the AGOA, and forgive me, it's the acronym itself is escaping me, but it is something where, while it's not a trade agreement in strict U.S. trade representative terms, it does include, some market access to them in exchange for, things along the lines of human rights and corruption mechanisms to deal with in those countries. So I believe leaning into those kinds of frameworks could be good for us, and also make sure that, again, we're not ceding that sphere just to China, and helping those countries, transition as justly as possible to, this energy future.
Yeah, I can imagine that there's a little bit of a catch up to make with regard to that part of the world and the Chinese position. But anyway, I think it's interesting to hear from what the US is doing on this. Please go over to Mr. Ritoe, your perspective on my question.
Yeah, I think, look, it's true that China has a very dominant position in the supply chain, and no doubt about that. But we do have to realize that China is also very dependent on mining, and that mining comes from countries outside of China. So mining in other jurisdictions, and we can learn from that. And now, one of the smartest things that, in my opinion, the Biden administration has done under the Inflation Reduction Act is by indicating, look, we'll give you tax credit support for the production of battery components and other critical components in the US. But if you want to benefit from these tax credits as a consumer, in the case of electric vehicles, for instance, a certain percentage of the material that goes into these components need to come from countries that we trust and we have free trade agreements with. So the funny thing is that if a critical mineral is processed in Canada under the Inflation Reduction Act, it's essentially considered being processed in the US, and the buyer or the consumer of the EV can benefit from something that has been processed in another country. And that's a very smart move. And I think we can learn from that. So when it comes to international cooperation, we need to offer our partners, like Abigail said, a value add. What is really important for our partners in order to get them across the line and sign a free trade agreement with us in order to collaborate in this supply chain. And one of the ways of doing that is by indeed going, for instance, to the mining companies in those countries and saying, look, you currently are only producing an ore. Why don't we work together to set up processing hubs? And we can do that in your country. We help you to take a stake in that processing hub, whereby we lower the financial burden for you to go downstream, but catch more value downstream. The product that comes out of that processing hub, we'll take it in Europe and finish it into a battery component or a material ready to go into battery component. And by the way, if you want to take a stake in that facility, you're welcome to join as well to even capture more value downstream. And I think it's models like that that will at least allow you to get more support as Europe or as the US when you reach out to especially developing countries, but also countries like Australia and Canada that have very big tradition in mining, because what you're offering to the mining companies there is basically a road to more value addition to what they're already doing.
Okay, that's interesting indeed, and you basically pick up from the economic and business perspective. So because your idea, as far as I understand it, is basically promoting business development for companies across the value chains, instead of just but I would say force them or incentivize them by taxes or tax reductions. Is basically offering them the other side is an opportunity. And I think that's also quite an interesting angle to it. So, but you also mentioned the free trade agreement, and that's I think an interesting one. So the question for me is, given your stake on, okay, why do we not take the economic route? How could we enhance that route? Maybe also with a free trade agreement then. And I'm not sure who is wanting to step in, but I think the floor is for those who want to.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick it off, Michel. I think it's also a mirror-looking exercise. We have to look ourselves in the mirror and ask the question: how important do we find it to secure materials, right, and minerals? Is it that important? Is it important enough to, for instance, also consider doing free trade agreements with countries that we know have different a different set of principles when it comes to human rights and a different set of values. I'm not saying that we should sign FTAs, free trade agreements with every crooked country, but if we set ourselves a goal to decarbonize significantly, the only way that we are going to achieve that is by securing the materials. And then we need to do an exercise and be honest to ourselves, where are those minerals located? Do I want to sign a free trade agreement, and under which conditions, knowing that if we don't do it, other countries that do not share our values will step in. And in addition, they will perhaps also do it with working conditions that are not ESG compliant.
Okay, clear. Abigail?
I can also hop in here, yes. Although I am not a trade expert, I admit I'm learning a little bit to be dangerous. And so I'm happy to hop in with some policy ideas that we're bouncing around here at SAFE. But essentially, we see trade agreements as being the step past, the kumbaya moment of, voluntary mining standards, which is essentially where we are right now. And as my, colleagues, I see Mr. Kotaro nodding his head. There are hundreds of voluntary mining standards, which are, implemented on a varying scale, and also, but essentially all sort of espouse the same kinds of basic truths, but with some have a couple more adjectives, tacked on to the beginning or the end. But how are we going to move beyond like, oh yes, isn't it a nice thing that we should all be doing this, to instead having something that is sanctionable and enforceable? And so as not a trade expert, I would say I'm not as familiar with the trade regulations in the EU and in Japan, but in the United States, I would say that our trade agreements are sanctionable and enforceable. And also, since, the May 7th agreement, which I believe was in 2010 or 7, all of our trade agreements now include environmental chapters. And in addition to those environmental chapters, when we've entered into trade agreements with some countries in South America, we've actually required even some changes to their constitution to make sure that they include, environmental agencies, and that they're not able to weaken their environmental laws in order to benefit their own businesses. And so that's also something that we have in the renegotiated United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA, which was renegotiated under the Trump administration. Those agreements also contain dispute mechanisms and committees where, we're able to bring a dispute to that committee and help other countries sort of address their shortcomings. This has been used in the past, I believe, under the previous iteration of USMCA with NAFTA, with spent lead acid batteries between the US and Mexico. These batteries used to be recycled a lot in the United States, but then, it became a bit cheaper to do it in Mexico. But then it came to light that, their environmental protections were not quite as good as ours. And that, I believe that air quality, and especially, I think, infant mortality went up in the regions where they were recycling these batteries. And so we were able to file a dispute through the dispute mechanism, help, Mexico look at its environmental regulations, I think with some capacity building from our US Environmental Protection Agency. And then they were able to raise those standards to make recycling their batteries more environmentally and community friendly. So that's just one example of the ways that a trade agreement is able to be have a bit more teeth than just saying, this is going to be nice, we're only going to, do things the right way. We can actually enforce those things with a trade mechanism. And so while it's a bit of a reversal of what we would like to do with the EU and Japan, I think, while they are not extracting as many minerals, the US should instead be working with them to sign an agreement that says, as I mentioned during my remarks, when we're importing raw materials, that we're only importing raw materials that are mined with high standards. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to counter any kind of dumping practices that are being done, where people are able to flood the market with lower cost materials because they are ostensibly getting them from places where they are degrading the environment or exploiting workers in a way that you would not be able to do if you were mining material, say, in the United States.
Yeah. So so some restrictions or regulations on top of the economic incentive that Amrish talked about. Mr. Kotaro, in your sheet, I saw there was an MOU between the EU and Japan, especially on R&D. What's your idea? Should that be extended to other parts of the value chain as well?
Yeah, so I'm also not an expert, a specialist of the free trade system. However, so looking at the reality of the global trading with China or the other countries, so if we try to establish a harmonized supply chain system between the United States, EU, and Japan, we should face some cost, the problem of cost competitiveness against with the Chinese manufacturers, because they sometimes supported by the internally, externally supported by the Chinese government as a subsidy or the other grant. So how to solve this problem? That is also one of the answer to this question, I think. So one of the solution, I think, is also making international standardization to level playing a field from the aspect of the sustainability. That is also one of the common value between us, United States, EU, and Japan. Sometimes some also Tertiary countries do not have such value on the supply chain. Though the reason why I'm working with some international standardization in the field of the sustainability, and also to making the level playing field to against for the such problem of cost competitiveness with the Chinese manufacturer. So I hope that this idea will be one of the good solution to this question.
Yeah, I understand. And yeah, at HCSS, we did indeed also do research on standard setting for all kind of critical raw materials. And what we found, actually, that was quite interesting, that say China is ramping up their number of people in standard setting organizations, especially in the mining part. But not only through the traditional well-known standardization organizations, but also through their commitments and contracts that they have with the Belt and Road Initiative countries, actually. So they basically try to establish more or less national standards with all those companies and countries, and then basically transfer that into the negotiations. Okay, we have already 20 countries doing this. Should this not be an international standard? And then, but that's more your profession, Mr. Kotaro, is that might also bring to the table standards that are lower quality than we in the West and Japan might envision. Is there a point in this, or do you not agree?
Yes, I agree with you. So the most important topic is that we should fight not only by the cost, but the value. Sometimes value is very connected with sustainability, like carbon neutrality, circularity, human rights, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, I think I'm just quickly looking at the questions of the audience. I think we touched upon more or less the questions that are being raised so far. But so there might be something that we could carve out a little bit further, even, and that is the still, I think the refining part, actually. So if you look at the concept that Amrish just alluded to, would it be an option for, like, for example, Japan to consider this kind of collaboration where you on both ends of the supply chain invest and work together on refinery? Mr. Kotaro.
Yeah, so I have a very good example about this topic. So when I have joined some webinar operated by the French think tank, so some expert of the European Union had a very same opinion with me. So training of the engineers for the intermediate process like the chemical process or concentrate process, metal alloy process will be the common solution between the EU and Japan, because the lack of the number of engineers is one of the shared issue for us.
Abigail?
I can jump in there as well. I believe there's also a case, though I may be mistaken, of either JOGMEC or METI setting up a copper smelting facility in Japan and actually entering into a partnership or own a stake in some copper mines in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
And that material is sent to those smelters in Japan, and then the offtake goes to either Sumitomo and Hitachi, I believe. That's sort of an interesting, and I think a really interesting roadmap that we should be looking into a bit more. It's interesting though, because, I think each of us is sort of speaking from a country level, not that I represent the United States in any shape or form, but, our countries all want to cooperate, but our companies all want to compete. And so we're trying to figure out ways that our companies might want to come together by sending, in the United States, we do market signals, right? In China, they're able to say, thou shalt do this, because the line between private industry and government is a little bit fuzzy, to put it nicely. And then in the EU, they have much more efficient regulation, I guess, which also helps to get industry to sort of get in line a bit faster. Over here, we're like, we'll help you do this, and hopefully they'll follow suit. But the traditional paradigm for minerals processing has been that mining companies, aside from China, which has developed their own model, but mining companies are really the ones that set up their own flow sheets because they're familiar with their specific deposit chemistry, and they can help. They are the ones that are funding the processing facilities. But due to all of the issues that we've talked about in terms of opening up new mines in some of these higher income countries, that traditional paradigm of mines being the ones that are solely responsible for the burden of processing is likely going to have to shift to downstream companies, in this case automakers, battery makers, clean energy manufacturers, defense manufacturers, perhaps ponying up some of their own cash to stand up these processing facilities, because they're incredibly expensive, hundreds of millions to billions of dollars to create. But it gets to these really complex questions of if they're going to go in together on this processing facility, what kind of material are they where are they going to get the material to process? How much offtake does one company get versus another? And while in a perfect world, it would be kind of not easy, but we'd be able to create that kind of equitable distribution of offtake. In reality, again, you're dealing with competition, and right now these businesses are instead going out and picking up stakes in mines, like Tesla, and most notably is entering into joint deals with mining companies. You have other automakers being like, we have to do what now? You want us to invest in a mine? And this is, and Mr. Ritoe can speak to this far better than I can, I'm sure, but the economics behind a mine are something that an automaker is not really traditionally accustomed to dealing with or understands quite as deeply as they probably need to at this point in time. So it's this really interesting culture clash between countries wanting to work together. I know in the US, we're different comments from different commissioners within the European Commission that this is a great power competition or strategic rivalry between the US and the EU. And I think when we saw that, we were like, no, this isn't between the US and the EU. This should be between all of us and, Xi Jinping. This shouldn't be between us. We should be friends. So again, countries wanting to cooperate, but businesses very invested in competing.
Okay. Yeah, we have 2-3 minutes left still, but and there's a question from the audience which is more geopolitical, and you actually raised the issue a bit, Abigail, is that some countries have and some do not have the materials actually. Yeah. So very short answers, maybe from all three of you, is what is the likelihood that the availability of critical materials is being used in this geopolitical competition as an escalator? Maybe Amrish to start with.
Yeah, I have a remark to make on what the previous speaker said, but let's answer your question first, Michel. I think we already have seen an example of that in 2011. When it wasn't an official embargo by China to Japan, but it was definitely China not helping to export rare earth oxides to Japan. I think the official reading of the Chinese government was that there were some issues with the customs, and they were acting very slowly. But that was a good example of how you can basically bully potential off-taking partners. Now, coming back to the statement, it's not, we shouldn't compete for this. It's not our Europe against the US. I fully agree. But let me be clear. For me, it's also not the EU, the US versus China. And the reason why I'm saying that is, look, we have to be realistic. We have to be obviously on our guard and make sure that we get access to materials. But if we as a human race don't succeed in getting these materials out of the ground, and we need cooperation for that, if we don't succeed in getting it out of the ground, we will have an issue at the end of the road, because we will not be able to combat climate change, right? Right now, if you look where the most EVs are sold, it's not in Europe, it's not in the US, it's in China. So from that perspective, the Chinese are contributing to lowering the GHGs. Admittedly, they do a lot of stuff that is bad, but yeah, I just wanted to highlight that we need to work together. Okay,
great. Maybe very short one also from you, Mr. Kotaro, if you want.
Yes, if I try to answer the Michel's question, and so yes, making a very good collaboration between the countries having the same value will be the good solution and answer to your question. Oh. Because making a portfolio between such countries is sometimes in another word that is free trade is better solution for the countries which does not have the resources, and yes, yeah, making some good collaboration on the supply chain, also some very critical raw materials, and also very keen technology like the EVs and wind turbines and so on, batteries.
Okay, Abigail, last words.
There's certainly a lot of saber rattling that's going on between Washington and Beijing right now. That's definitely not a secret. We believe that this is a little bit of something that the Chinese government has been doing very strategically for over 3 decades to control essentially the next industrial revolution and the shift from a fossil fuel-based economy to a clean energy economy. It's something that they've not made a secret. You know, they've even published things in English saying that, you know, they're very keen to corner this market, and good on them, because they have. I think that a lot of it has to do again with their industrial capacity. They saw the ability of, you know, South Korea, Japan, the United States to build a middle class on the back of their automotive sector. Chinese companies were not able to officially compete on internal combustion engine vehicles. They saw electric vehicles as an opportunity to leapfrog us in technology, and they have. And I believe I just saw a headline in Bloomberg just recently that they're going to be #2 in the world in car exports, you know, overtaking Japan and the United States, I believe, in our car exports. So how do we how do we compete with that? I would also say that, again, just in terms of political pawns, Ford Motor Company is very interested in working with CATL to build up battery factories. But I will just, point out that, when former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, took that diplomatic mission to Taiwan, that CATL said that they were no longer going to build a battery factory in the United States. And so thankfully, right now, we are not completely reliant on CATL for Ford's batteries. But what if it was 10 years down the line and we were, and they weren't going to send Ford batteries anymore because of our, geostrategic military positions. So, something we want to make sure can't be leveraged against us.
Okay. There's definitely a lot more to tell and to discuss, but unfortunately, we are through our time. And I'd like to also give the audience the opportunity to leg stretch for a couple of minutes. So before leaving you all, I would definitely like to have a big thank you for all the speakers. I think it was an excellent discussion. We did not solve all the problems, but we at least addressed them. And hopefully, if all of you are involved in solution spaces, then take this forward. And I'm looking forward to the solutions indeed in the end. So thank you so much, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.